Happy Friday, Dr. Richards.
Happy Friday, Dr. Leib. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How's the week going for you?
It's good. We were talking off air a little bit, but I'll reiterate. I'm pretty jacked up about the Phillies right now. Um, I don't I could see them winning, but I could also see them losing, which is like doesn't give any inclination, but like I would understand either way. I'm not
Yeah,
expecting them to
right.
win, but I am hopeful. But yeah, Sixers are like on the bottom of my mind right now in terms of Philly sports. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah.
Those are the best series to have when there's the expectations aren't too high right now, but they definitely have a chance. And I think it's good that they're playing a division foe, even if that division foe is the best team in baseball, that
Yeah.
they have a solid chance because they're very familiar with them. It's going to be a tough one, but it'll be exciting.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's a short series. If they can steal one
Right.
in Atlanta, then they've got a shot. But
They
we'll
could
see.
hit. They could hit with anyone, and I think Wheeler and Nola could win any game. But playoffs are interesting. You never know who's going to be like the pitching stud, and
I
that
know.
tends to make all the difference.
It's like you roll the dice every
Right.
game, but I'm hopeful.
All right. So today we're going to discuss knee pain. Last week we talked about low back pain, and in our discussion last week we sort of touched on some fundamentals of all orthopedic pain. One of them being that, and we've talked about this in other podcasts, that pain is not the same thing as structural damage. And we sort of discussed how that, certain imaging and certain diagnoses that are more in the structural realm are not the most useful thing for us as physical therapists. Same thing will be true for knee pain. And the other thing we really made clear last time was that what's really useful for us as therapists and movement professionals is knowing the with what when somebody reports pain. So today, what I wanted to try to do is just touch on some fundamental concepts about how to work around any knee pain, and then really discuss the common provocations, right? The squats, walking, running, things that people just talk about that bring on the knee pain, and then we can have a back and forth about how we think about modifying those actions to work around pain or try to build someone's body in a manner that decreases the amount of load that they're putting on their knee so that the load could be more shared throughout the whole body.
Hmm. Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. Where, I mean, looking at, I know we both see probably a lot of people with knee pain because that's one of the more experienced things. But what are the common, presentations you'll see? I know you talked about seeing it with squats, walking, running, lunging, whatever it is. What's your thought process around it, and where do you typically start with people say they're having trouble with squatting?
Yes, I think squatting is probably one of the most common reports that you get of knee pain, and it's almost a report to tell you why they can't squat, right? Like you haven't really assessed them yet. Someone comes in and they're already kind of giving you the red flag that squatting is not going to be for me because of so and so diagnosis or this knee pain that I've had for a while. So it's sometimes it's a little bit of a slow game to just even get somebody on board with trying to squat, right? And that's usually where I have to start people is, okay, like, yeah, I'm not even gonna like make it look like a squat. I might have somebody just stand up and sit down from a chair. We've talked about that in a
Yeah.
lot of podcasts, how useful of an assessment process that can be for so many things. But definitely for this, and you could usually see somebody's typical way of compensating just by having them get up from a chair, whether they feel like they have to push through their arms and use the arms of a chair, or if they are getting pain from standing from the chair, you can usually see some type of strategy that you could make an adjustment to. So the first
Hmm.
thing that, from a knee perspective with squats is going to be, how do we get it out of the knees, but still make it look like a functional squat, right? So
Right.
the squat is, for a lot of people, that, think squat, you think knees, right? But the squat is like probably the most complete movement you can do and incorporates the most joints that you can really think of. So how could we use the other joints, get more of the other joints involved so that the knees aren't as involved? And so then we're looking at a lot of times making something a little bit more hip oriented at first. So I might have somebody really show me if they can kind of reach their hips back, posterior weight shift a little bit more first, which will decrease how much they have to use their knees. And even if it isn't so functional at first, they have to bring their heads down. They have to really bring their torso into a more horizontal orientation at first. I just want to see if they notice that, okay, they still can get up and down from the chair doing it that way, but any discomfort they have in their knees is eliminated or decreased substantially. So oftentimes that's a first place that I'll start. And then we can look at, the joint below. So we got the hips that are the joint above, but the joint below is the ankles. Sometimes manipulating, putting people on elevated wedges, right? So that their heels are elevated, squatting downhill often makes a huge difference because it allows people to, again, shift their weight back, feel like they're sort of falling back without actually falling over, right? Because, there's so much about any type of exercise or movement where one is weight bearing, they're on their feet. One of the things we don't realize is how much the fear of falling takes precedent over anything, right? So if you don't feel stable with doing an exercise, your body is going to default to the thing that doesn't make you fall over. So a lot of times if you feel like you're going to fall backwards, your body's going to shift your weight forward, and that shifting your weight forward can load the knees more than you want it to, right? So we have to give people these references to say it's okay to actually shift your weight a little bit more back, which helps to put a little bit more load into the hips, maybe a little bit more load into the core, get you away from the front of the knee, which is a lot of times where people complain of knee pain. And then there's just the comfort of feeling like, okay, I can do that without falling over, makes a huge difference. And you realize like it's not about how much can you bend the knee. It's not about the act of even using the knee. It's really every time you do that movement, your weight has to shift forward more than you want it to because your body's telling you that's the only way I can do it without falling over. So, kind of coming at things from joint above, joint below, I think that's a common fundamental concept for a lot of pain in the body is like, how can we share the load? And then how can we move the load to a lot of times more proximally towards the center. But even in the case of the knees, it's the midpoint and the lower extremity between the hip and the ankle. So we got to really appreciate how do we get more motion at the ankle and how do we get more motion at the hip?
Yeah. And I think too, like the ramp can be a game changer for people to get them squatting like potentially just easier, more quickly or sooner. But I think the cueing is important about how you're doing it too, because sometimes I've seen with people like if it's too big of an incline, they almost just keep going forward more.
Yeah.
So it's learning the skill of being able to get on that and almost feel like you are kind of squatting or falling backwards in a way, like you're going down a hill. So I think that the actual skill of it comes into play. And the other thing I kind of look at with people in addition to what you're talking about is just local capacity at the knee. And this applies to all of the things all the movements we're kind of looking at today. But I think there's load sharing, and that's integral because a lot of times we run into issues when the knee is taking on more than it can handle. And I think that's in part because potentially it's doing too much, or it's also underprepared for the things we're asking it to do. So I think looking kind of locally at the knee itself, thinking quad strength is like a staple for knee pain and knee injuries. But looking there, can someone isometrically hold their body in, say, like a split stance position where their knee is bent just a little bit? But can they actually support themselves there for 20, 30 seconds without feeling or finding that fatigue? I think that's just, and that goes with any injury, but I think that plays a big role here as well.
Yeah, I think that's another, fundamental concept is you can kind of come at any injury from two avenues. One is sort of share the load, work around it, right? And I think it depends on someone's tolerance at any moment, right? So if somebody's coming in and they have like their subjective history is very much irritable pain, chronic pain, right? They're a high risk of things being made worse with very little activity, right? And those type of clients, a lot of times it's useful to maybe go down the load sharing route first. So you don't feel like you're actually working on the thing that they're already going to be hyper focused on because that's the painful thing. But eventually, I mean, rehab is not concluded until you improve the capacity of the joint that is the problem, right? So with the knee, I mean, there's many ways we can look at it from a range of motion standpoint. One thing I want to see from people is that they can eventually sit on their feet, right? Because that tells me that they have a full expression of knee flexion, right?
Mm.
Well, that'll at least be an assessment. And if they can't get there, we're filling in the gaps. And that becomes to me a great assessment that eventually becomes a position to sit in that you're able to maintain, hopefully for life, right? So if you can sit your butt on your feet, then you don't have a problem with bending your knee. So the joint doesn't, it isn't getting in the way of you bending your knee. So a lot of times you can have pain, but many people can do that. So I want that to be an assessment. And then I want to have people working towards that full range of motion as much as possible, as early as they can, with some type of support, that shows, gets them to do it where they're ready. And then the other side of that is, can they straighten their knee all the way? So, we're looking at range of motion at the knee. Can you bend it and can you straighten it? And then there's a rotational element that tends to go with the bending and the straightening. But we want to have some type of movement assessment, or I like to think like positional assessment, position of rest, ground sitting posture, that really shows the full expression of those directions of motion, right? So if there's a limitation there, at some point, if they're not getting that all back, there's going to be much more risk of pain. So, I mean, I think that's going to be important too. And then, like you said, then there's the component of strength, endurance, all of those things. And to me, that ties hand in hand with tolerance. So if you're, having them work on that, it's not just, can they do it before they collapse? It's also like, can they do it before any onset of discomfort or pain?
Right. Yeah. And that I use that test all the time, just ground sitting on your feet. And I think a lot of people, even if they don't really have significant knee pain or don't have knee pain, have trouble in that position at first too, because they're just not finding themselves there often. But like you said, that should honestly be a position of rest where we can all hang out for a certain amount of time. So I think there's so much benefit to being able to improve your tolerance to that position. And I've seen you work with people where you kind of build their legs up to them, essentially. Like you put a wedge or pillow or something between the butt and the heels so that they're able actually to relax into it. And you do a really good job explaining the importance of actually being able to rest and relax into it. Could you talk about that a little bit and kind of how you come at that?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of leaders in this idea is Philip Beach, who I think is either from New Zealand or Australia. I'm pretty sure New Zealand. And he wrote a book called Muscles and Meridians, which really great. It's a pretty complex book, but like you give it a couple reads through and you really see the importance there. But one of the things he talks about is these positions of rest that you see throughout, human history, but also throughout cultures currently. And it's, like sort of like positions of we're sitting on ourselves or we're using the ground as a contact point. And that they're really, if you break enough of them down, they're much better assessments of range of motion than putting someone on a table and using a goniometer, right? So the key though is that we want to eventually have someone be able to rest there. But at first, if there's a limitation or restriction in range of motion, it won't feel as restful. So there's this continuum, this assessment that we're always playing with to say, not only do I want to have like a goniometer reading that's acceptable, I want to actually be able to use this range of motion so that I can hang out in this posture longer. And I know like that's become my assessment for every joint is as often as possible is instead of getting my goniometer out, I want to think of a position that is very obvious when somebody's gotten better. And it's also very obvious when someone sucks at it, right? So like, I think that's really important. When you put somebody on a table with a goniometer, that might be obvious to us as physical therapists, but there's really not much reference for the patient. But if you look at the knee, I think it's pretty clear where there's a lot of ways like sitting on your feet is so, it's like this nice base of like automatic upright posture if you can get there. And it's an assessment of ankle function to some extent too, right? To be able to sit on your feet, you also have to ask, am I going to point my toes and be in plantar flexion, or am I going to sit on my toes, which is going to then stretch out the ankle towards dorsiflexion and the toes towards dorsiflexion, right? So there's multiple joints that are at play there. So that's also going to come into play when we're talking about functional things like squatting, descending stairs and things like that. So I think it go hand in hand, but because these ground sitting postures become positions of rest, I think ultimately they become the best assessments for this sort of static ability from a range of motion standpoint. But then as far as how do you get people to go from something that's really difficult to something that feels like a position of rest? Well, you need to have a contact point, right? So if you're asking somebody to sit their hamstrings on their calves, that's a contact point. If they can't get there, you have to make a contact point. Like you said, like you fill in the space, right? So how many places can you fill in the space between either, one piece of your anatomy and another, or from the ground in your anatomy, right? So at the ankles, a lot of times you have to put a yoga mat under the dorsum or the front part of the ankle. And, between the hamstrings and calves, you also have to use wedges, pillows, etc., to make somebody comfortable. And then it's a matter of adding the breath into the mix, right? So, all right, are you holding your breath? Can you take a full breath in? Can you take a full breath out? Right? We've done podcasts on breathing and how many different ways there is to direct that. But the idea there is just a noticing of how much are you guarding? How uncomfortable is this? And can we use the breath to turn the dial down on the guarding or the sympathetic response at that point? And then I think the last piece would be muscle contractions in a direction either towards your restriction or away from your restriction, but you're trying to create strength in that range of motion, right? So as opposed to just like hanging out there, if you can hang out there, good. You probably don't have to do any exercise. Now just maintain it, and that becomes a position that you have access to. But if you're working towards improving range of motion, then it's going to be, okay, can I contract my quadriceps, the quadricep being the major knee muscle that straightens the knee while I'm in this flex position? Can I contract it in an isometric fashion, release? Now maybe I get a little deeper into the position. Can I pull my calf towards my hamstring? And that would be more of or hamstring cue, right? So I'm actually promoting more knee flexion while I'm in this, compressed position. So I'm getting stronger in these end ranges. And I think that really quickly, it changes the game of how we're thinking about mobility. It's not this feeling of stretching, but it's really like, okay, I'm at my restriction. Now I'm actually doing some work to try to gain more of this direction that I'm limited.
Mm-hmm. I've seen improvements. Like I think there's something there too, more generally, to just actually using the muscles surrounding the knee, because I've seen improvements too, where it's like, take a look at that kneeling position and it doesn't feel good. And then we actually get the quad hot or actually work the knee in a way that's tolerable. That's going to look different for every person. And then come back to that in 10 minutes and it feels way different.
Right.
And I think the significance to that is just that it shows us this is a changeable pain. And, it's a point of hope that it's like, oh, I actually can feel better here in somewhat a short amount of time. Looking at walking, what are you kind of thinking about with that? I know it's the same principles, but what's different there?
With walking, we have to break down the gait cycle into, I like to do it in 3 positions, but like depending on how you learn gait, there could be a ton of different positions that you can basically break it down. Like there are snapshots of gait. I try to simplify it into 3 positions. There's sort of a stance phase where your body is stacked over one leg and the other leg is not on the ground. It would be sort of swinging through, but it's just you're in a one-legged stance at that point. And that's going to be the most compressive load on the standing leg, right? So you can see, all right, is that provoking pain? Or is the pain being provoked maybe when you're coming off of that leg? So then there's a heel strike where the other leg that would be off the ground starts to come down and makes initial contact with the ground. That stance leg stays pretty much the same on initial contact with the heel. And then there's going to be the point where you shift your weight from one leg to another and you roll over the leg that you were just standing on. So stance phase, heel strike, rollover, those are the 3 things that I tend to look at. And I'm looking for what part of the gait cycle is provoking the symptom. And sometimes what you find is if you slow people down enough to show them those 3 points of the gait cycle, one, you'll learn a lot about what they can't do well, you learn a lot about, balance. You learn a lot about stride length. But you might also find that the symptom cannot be produced just because you slowed it down, right? So then it might become a tempo issue. And I think tempo and stride length tend to go hand in hand, right? So if somebody's walking a bit faster and you slow them down and, it looks a little sloppy or doesn't hurt when you slow them down, a lot of times they're overstriding and they're landing harder than you want them to land, right? So that becomes part of the assessment. It's like, all right, we have to bring back the gait cycle. First thing I'm thinking of is shortening the stride length, trying to get people to walk in a manner that's a little bit more quick and light, as opposed to long and lumbering. So it's just, a lot of times that makes a big difference, but it takes practice, right? Because it's something that you're doing day in and day out. And there's a lot of resistance, because when you're trying to work with someone's gait, you kind of get this, I know how to walk type of resistance, right? And me knowing how to walk isn't the problem. It's my arthritis or something like that. Or I'm like, well, I can't do anything about your arthritis. I could help you walk differently. So you have to kind of play that game. And then it's like any other movement: positions, transitions, slow to fast, right? And having the same fundamentals, right? So the positions that I think are really important are head over rib cage over pelvis, like we've talked about in other podcasts. So we want to basically take a stacked line on one leg and then shift that to the other leg. And we want to do that in an alternating fashion as we translate our bodies forward. That's what we're looking for with gait. So we're trying to find, where is that inefficient? Where is that not natural for someone? Can we bring them back to those positions? So then a lot of times walking becomes maybe standing style positions, just in place shifting, just to teach the rhythm there and try to get people more comfortable with those positions. But 100% of the time, it shortens someone's stride. So I think that's like a main fundamental that works really quickly to decrease pain. Doesn't always feel real natural at first, but like it does make the change in pain, even if it doesn't feel natural. And then it's just a matter of practicing it to make it feel a little bit more natural.
I think the same thing applies with running too.
Yeah,
I mean, it's gait, so it's still to a certain extent the same, but there's a lot of talk about cadence, which is just how many steps you're taking in a minute.
Yes.
And in a way, there's research showing improving cadence may lead to decreased knee pain, or hip pain or ankle. But it's the same effect as you're shortening someone's stride in one way or another. It's just a matter of like, what are you having them essentially think about to do that?
Absolutely. And I think it depends on where the knee pain is with walking or running, like what your first cue for someone's going to be.
Yeah.
I think with running, there's the stride is going to matter, but there's ways that like adjusting someone's stride can almost make them run more inefficiently.
Yeah.
And the same thing can happen with walking, but I think it's more common with running. I've definitely gone through this in my own, adventures with trying to run better, where the stride needs to shorten, but it also has to be going with the forward momentum of a fall, right? Yep. So the pose running method, I really like the system that they have in place, like the actual like way that everyone's running. Like I think there's certainly flexibility there, but their system makes a lot of sense. And I think it's, again, another fundamental concept when we're talking about running would be you want you got to understand the position, the posture, the pose, as they call it. Then you have to appreciate that forward movement or movement really any direction is controlled falling, right? So with running forward, there is a fall that's taking place. And depending on the speed in which you're running, that fall will be at greater angles, right? Or you'll want it to be at greater angles. So if you look at like a sprinter running at certain points in time, like the angle from their head to their shoulder to their hip down through the leg, it tends to be at a greater angle as you're going faster. If you're a long distance runner, you're going to be a little bit more upright, but you're still really good, hopefully, at catching your fall. If not, what happens is you throw your leg out there and then you have to bring your body over the leg, as opposed to thinking of it as you're leading with the hips or the groins, but it's a forward inclination that your body is continuing to catch up with. right? And that becomes a difficult thing to comprehend, but it's a very valuable thing to train. And it carries over to a lot of other things too outside of running, like balance and cutting and agility, and just efficiency of movement in general. So it's really, instead of the person always creating the motion, it's really more you're trying to go with gravity and the fall as efficiently as possible. And then the last piece of that from the pose method would be you pull. So you pull your foot off the ground as opposed to thinking about pushing off the ground. You're pulling in a response to that fall, right? So you're pulling your heel under your hip pretty much. And a lot of times that's hamstring activity. And hamstring activity, as opposed to, say, too much hip flexor or lumbar activity, tends to be quite useful in protecting the knee. I don't like to be too muscle specific, but that's something that I'm sure you've seen as well,
Yeah.
is the hamstrings, if trained well, can be very, very valuable for protecting the knee because they tend to not be utilized in an ideal manner. So things get overloaded, right? And it's, to me, like training the hamstring better is more of an indication that you're moving more efficiently than it's like, okay, if I just train my hamstring in isolation, I'm going to be good. No, it's usually that you're teaching the body to move in a way that's a little bit more core to extremity, or you're getting the hips and the knees to work in a better relationship. So I don't know that it works to just strengthen your hamstrings in isolation and then you
Yeah.
put someone back into running and it's magic. But I do think like when hamstrings are working better, it's an indication that the posture is better, the fall is better, the pull is better, and all those mechanics there.
Yeah, that cue of push versus pull was such a game changer for me.
Mm-hmm.
When I first heard it, like I remember getting completely sore in a good way, in a different way. Like my hamstrings were toast, and
Mm-hmm.
for like the first time ever running, instead of feeling like my knees and my back.
Yeah.
So yeah, complete game changer there. And I think you said it best, like just because we potentially strengthen the hamstring doesn't mean it works better in the actual skill of running. And there's some research supporting that as well. But I think there is something to, well, if you don't actually have the prerequisite strength or capacity in that area too, then you're kind of at a loss. But I think in a lot of ways, like if you start training with that pose method and cues that you're talking about, you're
Mm-hmm.
actually going to likely get stronger
Yeah.
and the hamstring's going to start firing better or more efficiently as well, which is I know kind of what you were hinting at.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's walking and running. What we've got lunges we'd like to talk about, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think lunges and stairs, they're a nice segue from the discussion about walking and running, right?
Yep.
Because I think oftentimes the things that we need to train people on are very similar. It's just,
Yep.
You're going through a bit of a greater range of motion with the knee, with lunging certainly, and even stairs, if depending on how high the step is. But the intention for posture and even the idea of pulling, not pushing, is very much, to me, how I'm looking at training lunges and I'm training stairs to take load off of the knee. So, for instance, if I'm going to do a forward lunge, I want to think of it as just a forward step down to a half kneel, a kneeling position where now instead of me being in that stance phase like I was during gait, where my head is over my rib cage, over my pelvis, now over my ankle, well, I bent my knee, so now it's knee over hip over rib cage overhead, right? So that you're still finding that straight line, but now you're just in a kneeling position. So when I stand back up, if I'm moving forward with my walking lunge, then I'm going to end up actually in the same type of stance position, ideally, that I would with slow walking. If I'm going to do a forward step lunge and then push back into, my original standing position, I'm going to end up in that stance phase, but now I've just moved in reverse, right? So the positions and transitions are similar for walking as lunging. And that's why you can do something like a walking lunge. What tends to happen is everything wants to move forward because it's easier to do it that way, right? If it's just about feeling your legs burn and getting a workout in your legs and doing a ton of lunges just to get some type of metabolic charge, it's much easier to go faster by just keeping your body orientation where your head and shoulders are out in front of your hips. And then that just starts to load everything forward. So yeah, you'll feel your legs, but then after a while, you might start feeling your knees, right? So this weight shifting idea, which we talked about with the squat, is how do we get people back a little bit more, and how do we get them to share the load, right? So posture first, in a way, with this idea of trying to find a stacked line. And I think that becomes really important. And then being able to pull up from that position, not push down through the ground to get up from that position. Same thing with stairs. That's I kind of teach. Stairs is almost, to me, just like a shorter range of motion version of a lunge.
Mm-hmm. I think too, like a good visual for where your center of mass really is looking at the angle of the shin as you're moving through that of that front leg. Like typically the more forward you're going to be, the more it's called a positive shin angle, or where the knee is pushing over the toes. And again, nothing bad, but that may be putting more stress on the knee, which could be what we want. It also may be what we don't, versus keeping more of a negative shin angle, or where the knee is behind the ankle a little bit more, or even vertical, maybe a little bit more friendly to start. And I think too, thinking about that cue of pulling yourself up is going to naturally lend itself a little bit more towards that.
Yep. And I think that brings up like a really good discussion then about, the idea of like knees over toes. And, the knees over toes guy, Ben Patrick's very popular right now. And I love his stuff. But I think the conversation there fits into what we were talking about is, there are things where you sort of want to be working around pain. And then there's stuff that you have to like really go into what you think the problem might be to really prove to yourself that you're resilient, that you're recovered. Right. And I think, his stuff, you could take that into any joint in the body, right? There's all these artificial rules of what people tell you not to do, or you're going to hurt yourself. It's nonsense. But when pain is active, depending on how sensitive the pain is, right, you may have to not go into something that's threatening for somebody for a while, right? And you have to have a way to eventually get there, but it may be a patience game to get people to trust the process in a way, right? So I think I love the fact that those models are getting popular, because just by somebody looking into it, they've already got this sort of social backing to trust that process. They're probably going to find what's being done a bit less threatening. However, a lot of people can't go right into that. So you have to have another way to say, yeah, like maybe that's a great end game. Like if someone could do that, their knees, their ankles, they're working at a very high function. You do not want to be afraid. You want to be able to do that. Your knees will be healthier in the long run if you can go there. But what happens if you can't get there yet? What do you work on? How do we kind of just take this as a step-by-step continuum? All right. Well, a lot of times we have to start with, like the more vertical shin position, because that's all that's doing is just getting us to load other parts of the structure first. But then once we do that, we're still keeping these same fundamentals in line. So if you see something like a knees over toe lunge, for instance, that's that same angle of head over rib cage, or should be, I think, head over rib cage over pelvis. But now the whole orientation of the body is slanted forward. So there's not an excessive arching in the back. There's not a hinging of the hips. It's just you're taking this half kneeling position, which was more vertical and upright, and then you're taking that same straight line and slanting it forward a little bit. And while you do that, the knee angle and the shin angle change, right? So then that's hopefully what we're looking for. In that process, hopefully we still have some activity in the hips. We have activity in the ankles. We have activity in the center of the core, so that even when you're moving into that full range of motion under load, the load isn't all on the knee. Like that's not the goal, is to ever put the load all on the knee, even though it looks like the angle is very compressed, right? So if somebody has no strength elsewhere in their body and they go and do that, they're not going to be able to tolerate it. It's going to hurt. It's going to be problematic just because, and they're not going to be able to come out of it. There's not going to be this controlled in and out, right? So the demonstration of control oftentimes allows you to do whatever you want, right? Like you can move into any angle of any joint you want. And that's going to be our goal, because that's saying, yeah, we can move through a full range of motion or a progressively fuller range of motion with control. And that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, that's also just another way to put it, is like that continuum of protecting a joint towards exposing it towards more stress, or protecting a muscle, or whatever the actual it is, but protect to expose. And a lot of times in rehab, we're starting more so on that protect side, which is where you're talking about load sharing and gradually shifting more towards exposing it while keeping the same principles and fundamentals that we started with.
Right. And here's where I think strength and conditioning just comes into play. It's, Dan John uses the terminology. It's like it gives you a bigger glass, right, in which to put your liquid in, to put your contents in, right? So if let's say you squat and you're used to squatting at, a decently high weight, maybe not even going through a full range of motion, but your body's used to taking high loads with squatting, but then that starts to hurt. Let's say like you're squatting 300 pounds, that starts to hurt. Well, you have all this capacity to turn that load down and still function versus someone who is afraid to squat in any manner, right? Like other than maybe getting up from a high seat, right? Now they have no capacity to make adjustments. You have no buffer zone, right? So strength to me is like, it just gives you this big buffer zone, right? It doesn't mean that like your life is pain free. Quite the contrary, because a lot of times you're always pushing the limits. But when you take yourself out of the controlled environment of training, life is so much easier than your training that you have this huge buffer zone. And, that's not just from a strength perspective. That should also be from a range of motion perspective, a speed perspective, right? A power perspective, right? Because life calls for all of these things. So there's plenty of people that can squat like to parallel with like astronomical weights, but they can't sit on their feet, right? They've lost, or they can sit on their feet, but it's very uncomfortable. They can't move in and out of it smoothly. And right, and like if you're a high level power lifter, that's not your intention. Like you don't need that. You just need to be able to lift heavy weights to your limit. But eventually there's a buffer problem, right? Like something you might be great at, but you really suck at something else. So, and then the goal is to figure out like, how can we fill in those gaps? When we're working with an athlete, you got to be careful how much you fill in those gaps, like for the window of performance that they're looking for. But a lot of times outside of that, we have to try to help people understand the difference between athletics and health and longevity, where it's like, all right, let's be adequate at a lot of things, or let's be, progressively more above average at more things, as opposed to trying to be, the best at one thing. All right, I think because then you start to have this buffer zone in many domains of fitness.
I think even with athletes, the same thing applies to a certain extent too, where strength training and what we do in the gym to a certain extent is going to be pretty general overall compared to what they do in their sport. So yeah, we want to improve some specifics to what's going on, but I think with everyone, it basically gives us these affordances, an ability to withstand certain positions, and athletes need that like anyone else too, I think.
Yeah, and I think all athletes need it, and I think depending on the athletic endeavor, some athletes need it more than anyone, right? Like if it's an endeavor where there's a lot of uncontrolled movement, and it's like team sports, I think a lot of times where you're constantly moving and cutting, like you have no real knowledge of how you're going to move in any given night, right? Because like you're not thinking about that. The game is dictating it for you. With a sport like powerlifting, you actually have planned out how you're going to move. Like, it. So like it's a little bit more predictable. So I think in those you still want a buffer zone, but you got to be careful you're not taking away exactly like what you need, right? Like having too much of a buffer zone the other way, we might take a little bit of force production away here and there. But you do still want I think the buffer zone is like, you don't want to have the range of motion to be exactly at your, like level and no more, right? Like you want definitely more range of motion than the actual like standard, but you might not need to have that much more. You might not need to have it in multiple directions, but after you're out of that sport, or maybe in like a off season phase, you should probably start working on some other things, right? Just that's what's going to keep you in the game longer. But people that are, doing agility based sports, basketball, lacrosse, field hockey, things like that, where, the game is dictating how you move, right? You want to have this buffer zone of multi-directional motion, range of motion, because who knows when you're going to have to lunge yourself forward and be strong there. And that's going to make you a better performer, I'd imagine, right? If you look at someone like, I'm not really a huge tennis fan, but one thing I could observe watching it as a movement professional is someone like Novak Djokovic. He's so good at getting long, like in a lateral stance, like just basically being in a middle split and being powerful, being able to come out of that and then change direction, right? And like a guy like Patrick Mahomes, if you watch the documentary Quarterback, why is he so unique? I never thought about that until I heard his trainer talk about it, but he's able to keep his head forward and turn his torso, at a greater angle than any other player in the league. So that's why it looks like he's doing no look passes all the time but he's putting like perfect velocity on them because his body is so squared up to the target, even though his head's facing in like the other direction, right? That's just something that's unique to him, right? So he has all this extra range of motion, which makes it unique, right? So it doesn't mean that everybody who's got that range of motion is going to be Patrick Mahomes, but you get a buffer zone for being stronger by having more range of motion a lot of times. And then you have to pick your sport. You have to like kind of know what the specificity is there. But I think when, I work outside of that most of the time, and it is sort of the conversation of just having people understand why it's so important to just train the things that life is taking from you, right? And thinking of it from that perspective that our intention here is not to get you to necessarily look buff. That might be secondary. It's not necessarily to get you to lose weight. It's to get the training that we do, this controlled environment, to feel much harder than daily life, so that daily life becomes easy, no matter what age you are.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly said. And I don't have anything to add on for that, frankly.
I think, is there any other movements that you see provoke knee pain on the regular that we missed? Squatting, walking, running, lunging, and stairs. Any distinction? I think we can make a distinction between going upstairs and downstairs, because I think that's something that's a different presentation in my mind, or oftentimes like a different place in the rehab process. Some you notice as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of again comes down to like that protect to expose and looking at that management. I mean, there's multiple different things going on, but I think just keeping it simple and looking at that shin is having to move a lot more forward, typically going downstairs compared to going upstairs. It's also it's an eccentric stress, so it's a lowering stress versus a lifting type of stress, and that's a little bit different. But I think most simply, and how I talk about with clients, is like that, your knee is having to travel a lot further forward, and you're having to control your weight to a greater extent, because going upstairs, you can always get a little bit of help from that down leg that's kind of giving you an extra bump. But yeah, I think about it a little bit differently as well.
Yeah, I think you're like going downhill or downstairs is more of an agility game. We're going uphill, upstairs is more of sort of like a cardio and strength game. And I think oftentimes it's easier to decrease somebody's pain going up, especially knee pain. Even though you're sort of making it harder for them, just by like, if you actually have a higher incline, sometimes a higher step, there's going to be more need to use your hip. There's going to be need. There might be more likelihood of compensation too. But the idea there is like, okay, the goal is to take the load out of your knee and bring it to your hip. Going upstairs, I think, is an easier thing to feel that with. If you were to slow it down going downstairs, it feels a lot like a one-legged squat, which is, a lot of times the load is going to be more in the knee. So two things that I like to really work on there is I go after the ankle pretty quick. So, doing some type of dorsiflexion, where you're putting the ball of the foot or the front of the foot up compared to the heel, and then adding some like single leg knee bends, like step down type of movements there, where you're not going to be able to bend your knee as much because the ankle is taking a lot more of that load. But it teaches, the ankle to kind of get involved a little bit more with that downward motion, and then working agility. And I saw this when I climbed Kilimanjaro. It was, I was there with people that were in their 70s, and they were very fit people. They were had done plenty of like marathons and high endurance events, and they did pretty well going up, but they really struggled going down because the balance and the agility element was totally different. Where someone like me, or I was I was so happy to go down because, the altitude and all of that starts to get easier on the way down. And it became like a little game where, you're instead of going straight down, you're hopping from rock to rock, right? It's like a little bit of an agility game, which I'm familiar with. It felt like doing sort of like agility ladder and basketball drills and things like that. So, but it is this idea of like becoming progressively lighter on the feet, like we talked about with gates, going with the flow of momentum. So you may teach somebody to move a little slower, take the knee out of it, use the ankle a little bit more, maybe use the hip and the core a little bit more. But ultimately, you have to teach people to be more confident going with the flow of going down a step. So it's, I might teach a down step, tap, tap, right? You step one and then the other, so that the idea becomes landing light and continuing to go with the flow, right? Obviously, that could be, fear producing, right? Because if you do that wrong, you might topple down the stairs. So it's a game to play safely, but I think ultimately it's necessary is that agility has to improve for the knee to take less load going downstairs.
Mhm. I also think it's easier too for people going down. I'm thinking like a single step, like off a
Mm-hmm.
box. Like it's a lot easier for people to go down backwards on
Yes.
that than
Yeah.
forwards too. So
Right.
sometimes or a lot of times I'm starting with like a step down almost backwards
Yes.
with hand support, so that people are feeling safe and are able to control the impact of the foot as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and then we'd wrap it up here. Is like you can look at this idea of training different positions, not just from a standpoint of adding more assistance, but you can actually change the direction of it. So it still gives somebody the practice that they're looking for. So teach them how you would want it to look to descend a step and do that backwards, and then maybe progress to sideways, and then eventually it's going to be straight on, and the load there is very different, but the joints are moving in a similar action and similar direction, but the muscle orientation changes. So, which is a valuable thing because now you build up more of a balanced load. It's more load sharing, but there is still this motor learning component that you're teaching. And I think it's a nice way to look at progression.
Mhm. Absolutely.
All right, I think that was pretty complete for what I wanted to talk about with the knee. I think this is definitely one of the more common areas. You see this in the lower back, but I think sometimes the knee is one of those things that people protect. They can protect more than the back, right? Like the back is a harder thing to protect, and people will still try to overprotect it. But the
Mhm.
knee, it's just like it's one of those things. Yeah, I'm not going to sit low anymore. I'm not going to kneel anymore. I'm not going to squat
Yeah.
anymore. And then that starts to lead to more load into the back because you can't use your legs in the same way. But it's a lot of knee pain out there. I know it's one of those things too with high level activity as you get into higher levels of function. The knees will talk to you. They're right between your hips and your ankles, and they're going to be there for you. So it's nice to know how to manage them and kind of work with them. So hopefully this
Yeah.
was useful for the listeners out there. If you have any more specific question on your knee pain, please feel free to reach out and we'll do something specific to you.
Awesome.
All right, I'll see you next week.
See you next week.